I've never really been a camping kind of person, but something about the idea just kept gnawing at me. I wanted to prove to myself I could do it alone. One crisp fall weekend, I finally decided to take the plunge. I chose a place called Oak Hollow, a remote campground about 2 hours outside the city. Reviews called it quiet, undiscovered, and a peaceful escape from the everyday noise. It seemed perfect. I arrived just past noon. The campground was deserted, which was both comforting and a bit unnerving. I wasn't entirely alone, though. A ranger station sat at the entrance with a friendly older woman, Lydia, in a faded green uniform. She handed me a map, her gnarled finger tracing the trail to a great camping spot, just over a mile down the path. "You'll be fine," she reassured me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just don't wander too far from camp after dark. Oak Hollow's got a habit of losing people." She laughed, but there was something in her tone that made my stomach flip. I thanked her, hoisted my pack, and set off. The air was crisp and the autumn leaves crunched under my boots, the colors of the forest transforming as the sun dipped lower. My chosen site was nestled between two ancient oaks, overlooking a clearing where a tiny stream trickled by, just visible through a dense wall of pines. It felt isolated yet peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent the next couple of hours setting up my tent, arranging my supplies, and exploring the immediate area. I found some broken branches and dried twigs for a small fire and enjoyed the satisfying crackle as the flames came to life. Darkness fell earlier than I anticipated, though, and soon, the forest was bathed in deep shadows. As I sat by the fire, the quiet of Oak Hollow started to weigh on me. Unlike the city, where noise is a constant, the silence here felt oppressive, almost intentional. My own breathing seemed amplified. I could hear every snap, every rustle, every sigh of the trees as they moved with the breeze. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was only darkness, cloaking the forest in a dense, silent mystery. It was around midnight when I first noticed something strange. The fire had died down, and I was about to crawl into my tent when I caught sight of a flickering light in the distance, somewhere far down the path. My first thought was that someone else had arrived at the campground, but it seemed so odd that anyone would be setting up this late. I stared, squinting into the shadows, trying to discern movement. The light swayed, like a lantern in a breeze, then vanished. My heart raced, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. I zipped up my tent, burrowed into my sleeping bag, and told myself to ignore the eerie feeling gnawing at my gut. I don't know how long I lay there, half asleep, when I heard it. A faint humming, drifting through the still night air. I froze, straining to listen, my breath shallow. The hum was soft but distinct, the kind of sound that seemed to echo without a clear origin. It was almost melodic, a tune that felt strangely familiar and completely foreign at the same time. I tried to shake off the discomfort, convinced myself it was just the wind, or perhaps an owl. But the humming didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, resonating with a strange, haunting quality that chilled me to the bone. My hand went instinctively to the zipper of my tent, ready to pull it open, but I stopped, unable to move, paralyzed by a primal sense of dread. The humming ceased abruptly, leaving a void of silence so deep it felt like the forest was holding its breath. I told myself to relax, that it was nothing, a trick of the mind. But as I lay there, a new sound replaced it, faint but distinct. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay silent, barely breathing as the footsteps grew louder. I thought of Lydia's warning and cursed myself for not taking it more seriously. Each footfall sounded deliberate, like whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. The steps paused near the back of my tent, and I could almost feel the weight of eyes on me. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath again, waiting. Then, in the stillness, a whisper broke the silence. "Are you lost?" The voice was soft, almost tender, but the words were sharp as ice. My heart thundered, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. But I stayed frozen, hoping that if I didn't move, whatever it was would lose interest. Minutes passed. The footsteps resumed, this time retreating back into the woods, each step growing fainter until there was only silence again. I didn't sleep that night, lying rigid in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, listening to every creak and rustle outside. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept into the tent, I was already packed, shoving my things into my bag with shaky hands. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. I just wanted to get out of Oak Hollow. The thought of what might happen if I stayed another night was too horrifying to contemplate. As I made my way back down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from last night or the flickering light in the distance. The trail felt longer than before, stretching on, winding through unfamiliar bends. A sense of foreboding weighed down on me, thickening the air with every step. I finally reached the ranger station, nearly stumbling as I approached. Lydia was inside, her eyes lifting to meet mine with an odd, knowing expression. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of satisfaction. I think I saw someone out there last night," I managed, my voice hoarse. "They were humming, asking if I was lost." Lydia's smile faded, and for a second, her expression hardened, a flicker of something dark passing over her features. She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Oh, they've been out there a long time, looking for company," she said, her voice low. "Once you hear them, they never really leave you." Her words sank into my mind, heavy and suffocating. Without another word, I turned and stumbled out of the station, her final words echoing in my ears like a curse. The entire drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something on the road behind me. And even now, weeks later, I can still hear that faint humming when the nights are quiet, like a distant memory creeping into my mind. Soft, almost melodic, just on the edge of hearing. It feels like Oak Hollow's trying to call me back, as if it never really let me go. And no matter how far I run, part of me wonders if I'll ever truly escape that haunting, echoing tune in the shadows. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. After a busy few months, the idea of disconnecting and spending a night alone in the woods sounded perfect. I'd picked a spot deep in Birchwood Forest, far enough from any marked trails that I wouldn't be disturbed. This area was remote and largely unknown, the kind of place people avoided simply because they never ventured this deep. The unsettling quietness is what first struck me as I parked my truck on the narrow trail, deep in the secluded part of Birchwood Forest. I'd chosen this spot precisely because of its remoteness. I wanted to experience the isolation, to distance myself from the everyday hum. Solo camping had always been an escape for me, but this time felt different, a little more intense, and for reasons I couldn't quite pinpoint. I spent the better part of the afternoon setting up. I unfolded my tent, secured my gear, and laid out a few essentials in the small clearing. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of the trees in the light breeze and the distant chirping of birds. By the time the sun began dipping behind the tree line, I'd gathered a stack of dry wood to get a campfire going later. Just as the last traces of sunlight slipped away, I took a deep breath and enjoyed the silence. It was almost hypnotic, until a sudden rustling sound snapped me back to reality. I turned around, expecting to see a curious animal. Instead, about 50 yards from my campsite, there was another figure. A man was standing in the shadows, his face partially obscured by the low light. He wore a thick coat, with the hood pulled up, though I could still see glimpses of a rugged, unshaven face. He raised his hand in a casual wave, and I found myself nodding back out of instinct, though his presence unnerved me. "Didn't expect anyone else out here," he called, his voice carrying easily in the quiet woods. He stepped a little closer, but not quite into the circle of my campsite's light. "Yeah, it's pretty remote," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I like it that way," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked around as if considering something before adding, "Mind if I set up nearby? Just for tonight?" I hesitated. It felt odd to be sharing such an isolated spot with a stranger. But he didn't seem dangerous, just out of place. After a beat, I nodded. "Sure, it's a free forest," I said, though I wasn't quite sure why I'd agreed. He drifted back to the edge of the trees, disappearing from view but leaving a slight sense of unease lingering behind. I returned to my fire, keeping myself busy as the dark closed in around me, the trees casting thick, jagged shadows in the flickering light. An hour passed, and the silence returned, heavier than before. The man hadn't made a sound since he'd left, and though I strained to listen for his movements, all I heard was the crackling of my fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I began to wonder if he'd actually set up his camp or if he was still somewhere nearby, just out of sight. Curiosity, or maybe concern, got the better of me. I stood up and wandered toward the direction he'd walked, scanning the tree line. "Hello," I called softly, not wanting to sound too eager. There was no response, only the swaying branches and the dim shapes of trees. I took a few more steps, my flashlight sweeping across the ground, when it caught something unusual. A small pile of belongings lay abandoned at the base of a large tree. A worn-out tent, a sleeping bag, and a small backpack, all looking as if they'd been left here for a long time, untouched and unkempt. But the man was nowhere in sight. A chill ran through me. There was no logical reason for him to vanish without setting up, especially if he'd planned to camp. I backed away, returning to my fire. I tried to convince myself that he'd simply gone for a walk, but a strange sensation nagged at me, a primal warning echoing in the back of my mind. The fire burned lower, casting shadows that seemed to twist and contort around me. I added a few more logs, hoping the flame would last through the night. Minutes drifted by in silence, and I began to feel a creeping sense of paranoia, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Then, a soft crunch sounded from somewhere nearby, followed by another, closer. I held my breath, listening. The noise moved around my camp in a slow, almost deliberate circle. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but it revealed nothing. "Is someone there?" My voice was thin, even to my own ears. Silence answered, thick and oppressive. The crunching resumed, this time moving to the other side of my camp, just outside the fire's reach. Shadows flickered ominously in the undergrowth, and I could swear I caught a glimpse of movement, a fleeting figure slipping behind a tree. Panic tightened my chest. I grabbed a stick from the fire, brandishing it like a torch, and circled around, sweeping my light wildly across the trees. The air felt charged, as if something unseen was watching me from the shadows. Just as quickly as the sounds began, they stopped. The forest returned to its unnatural stillness, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves. I turned back to my tent, half expecting to see the man standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just the lonely emptiness of my small campsite. I climbed into my tent, zipping it closed as tightly as I could and gripping my flashlight with trembling fingers. For what felt like hours, I lay there, waiting for the next sound, for any sign of movement. But none came, only the low crackle of the dwindling fire outside. Sleep eluded me, my mind racing with images of that stranger and his abandoned belongings. What had happened to him? And why had he vanished so suddenly? My imagination ran wild, weaving stories of vengeful spirits or something even darker lurking in the forest. Around midnight, a new sound cut through the night, a distant humming, soft but unmistakable. It was a low, melodic tune, drifting through the trees like a lullaby. My blood ran cold as I listened, recognizing the voice. It was him. The humming grew louder, almost as if it were circling my tent, moving from one side to the other, growing closer with each pass. I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest as I strained to hear every note, every syllable. It was haunting, filled with a strange sorrow that sent shivers down my spine. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I waited, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand, terrified to make a sound. Hours passed without incident. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, the remnants of that haunting tune echoing in my dreams. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled out of my tent, blinking in the harsh morning light. My campfire was nothing but cold ashes, and the forest seemed almost normal again. I looked around, half expecting to find some sign of the man, but all that remained was his worn-out gear by the tree, untouched. With a sense of urgency, I packed up my belongings, eager to leave. As I turned to walk back to my truck, I spotted something on the ground where my tent had been. It was a small, folded piece of paper. With shaking hands, I opened it. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 3 words: "See you soon." I stared at the note, my mind racing. Had he left it there last night, or was it waiting here all along? A chill ran through me as I scanned the trees, half expecting to see him watching me from the shadows. But there was no one there, only the endless, silent forest. My name is Luke, and last spring, I decided to test my endurance with a solo camping trip deep in the woods. I camped before, sure, but never alone. Friends had always been there, sharing the adventure, laughing off weird sounds in the dark. But this time, I wanted to see if I could handle it by myself. I drove out late on a Friday, my old sedan rattling along as I wound through back roads and rugged terrain to reach the trailhead. The sun was already beginning to set as I pulled in, the trees casting long shadows over my car. I grabbed my pack and slung it over my shoulder, taking a last glance at the car before heading into the woods. The spot I picked was about 2 miles in, remote enough to avoid other campers, close enough to make a quick exit if I needed one. The hike was quiet. No sounds but the crackle of leaves under my boots and the occasional distant bird call. I reached my campsite as the sky was slipping from twilight into full darkness. The spot felt perfect, a small clearing surrounded by dense trees with a view of the darkening sky. But as I began to unpack, that peaceful feeling was replaced by a strange, creeping unease. It was almost as if the trees were holding their breath, watching me. The quiet felt heavy, like something had drained the air of its natural sounds. I pushed the thought away, setting up my tent and building a small fire to ward off the chill. I sat by the fire, eating my dinner and trying to enjoy the solitude, but the silence grew thicker, pressing down around me. Then, from somewhere beyond the firelight, I heard it, a faint, low rustling in the underbrush, like something large moving through the leaves. I froze, my eyes locked on the darkness, trying to see what was there. But I saw nothing, just the impenetrable wall of trees. I laughed it off, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer. This was the wilderness, after all. Animals were bound to wander by. I stoked the fire and leaned back, focusing on the warmth and trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around me. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer. The sound was heavier, almost as if something were dragging itself over the ground. My heart thudded. I shone my flashlight into the trees, sweeping it in wide arcs. But all it illuminated were dense branches and tangled roots. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing mind. Then, just at the edge of my vision, I caught a glimpse of something, a silhouette. It was low to the ground, its shape barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. Before I could even make out what it was, it slipped back into the darkness, silent and quick. I felt a cold shiver down my spine. Whatever that was, it wasn't a raccoon. It wasn't a deer. I tried to tell myself that it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, that my nerves were getting the better of me. But something about that shape, it didn't look like anything I'd ever seen. The fire crackled, but its light felt small and frail against the weight of the night. The forest around me was utterly silent now, as if everything had stopped to listen, to wait. Then, I heard it again, the dragging, crunching sound, now circling around my camp, just beyond the light. It moved slowly, deliberately, almost like it was testing the boundaries of the firelight. I clutched my flashlight, my hands shaking as I strained to hear any other sounds, to glimpse any other movement. But all I could hear was the crunch, pause, crunch, as whatever it was continued its slow, creeping path around me. I didn't dare make a sound, barely dared to breathe. My instincts screamed at me to run, but something kept me rooted in place, as if moving would break some delicate balance that was holding it back. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Silence settled over the campsite, thicker than before, pressing in from all sides. My flashlight felt dim, as if the darkness were swallowing up the beam. And then, from somewhere nearby, I heard a soft scraping, almost like claws dragging over metal. The hair on my arms stood on end as I realized where the sound was coming from. My car. My car back at the trailhead. It was impossible. I had walked 2 miles to get here, but the sound was unmistakable, faint yet insistent, carrying through the air like a warning. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed toward my tent, every nerve on edge. I considered just huddling inside until morning, but the thought of staying out here with whatever was circling my camp was unbearable. I made a decision. I was leaving. I gathered my pack as quietly as I could and doused the fire, trying to avoid drawing any attention. The darkness closed in around me as I slipped onto the trail, the path back to the trailhead stretching before me, dark and unwelcoming. I kept my flashlight low, moving quickly but silently, listening to every sound around me. The woods felt alive with a different energy now, as if I were being followed, watched from just beyond the reach of my light. Occasionally, I'd hear a crunch or a rustle just off the path. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep moving. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the glint of my car in the moonlight. Relief flooded through me, and I quickened my pace, practically jogging the last few steps. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The paint on the car's hood and sides was streaked with long, deep scratches, like something had raked claws across the metal. The windows had faint smears, as if something had been pressing its face against the glass. My stomach twisted. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and climbed inside, locking it immediately behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down before starting the engine. But just as I turned the key, I heard it, a faint, scraping sound from the back of the car, something dragging across the trunk. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty woods behind me. The car roared to life and I sped out of there, the tires kicking up gravel as I tore down the road, not daring to look back. Even as I left the forest behind, the feeling of being watched, of something waiting just outside my vision, didn't leave me. When I got home, I inspected the car in the daylight. The scratches were worse than I'd thought, deep gouges that ran the length of the vehicle, almost as if something had been trying to get inside. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just an animal, but no animal could have done that. No animal would have left those smears on the windows, those claw-like marks on the hood. It's been months now, but sometimes at night, I'll hear a faint scraping sound outside my window or catch a glimpse of a shadow slipping out of sight. I know it sounds impossible, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered that night, it followed me. And it's still out there, waiting, watching just beyond the light.